Hi, welcome. It's the Brass Check podcast, and we're bringing back a guest that we've had a couple of times before, and we're doing that because this topic is so important, and it's really not being covered seriously that I can see almost anywhere else. He's an expert on this. He's made an in-depth film, which I hope everybody's had a chance to at least see segments of, but if you haven't, let me just tell you right now, it's called A Very Heavy Agenda. Well, you can see it at averyheavyagenda.com, or you can see clips of it. But the name of the film is A Very Heavy Agenda, and it's about, I think, one of the most important issues of our time, which is that we are consistently being driven to war by a group of forces, and that's the group we're going to discuss today. And whether it's invading the Middle East or getting on a war footing with Iran, or this endless war that's been going on between the U.S. and Russia, the Soviet Union, now Russia, and we're consuming. Besides all the death and destruction that's taken place in places like Syria, and then years ago in places like Vietnam, billions and billions and billions of dollars that could be used for our society is being burned up, going up in smoke, and the news media is predictably out to lunch. Our political class is predictably out to lunch. And the thing that stimulated me to call, and let me tell you, we're going to be talking with Robbie Martin, the maker of A Very Heavy Agenda. The thing that stimulated me to call him is Dennis Kucinich was recently on the Jimmy Dore show. And if you don't know Jimmy Dore, you're in for a treat. Just D-O-R-E, he's great. He had Dennis Kucinich on, and Kucinich was talking about the fact that it looks like what he calls the deep state has yet again hijacked our foreign policy. Now, those of you that have been sort of following Trump and so on, one of the promising things about Trump, and there isn't much promising about him, but one of the promising things about him was he seemed not to be on board with the endless war on Russia theme. He thought it was ridiculous. He was basically saying, we need to talk with them. We need to partner with where possible. Seems logical to me, but that's running counter to the well, we're going to talk about what it's running counter to. So first of all, Robbie, welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Ken.
And did you get a chance to take a look at what Kucinich said? And let's maybe use that as our point of departure. And first of all, I'm so glad that he said something on this, and I'm so glad Jimmy Dore gave him a vehicle to talk about this, because I just don't hear this topic being discussed. We're being slid right back into a war footing again, and nobody seems to be paying attention. So, did you get a chance to see Kucinich's statements?
Oh, absolutely. And I thought they were very interesting because the term deep state has been something that you and I have probably heard numerous times and frequently in sort of the avenues we seek information from, but it's very rare for a term like that to break through into the mainstream. And Kucinich appeared on Jimmy Dore's show. I actually didn't watch that specific appearance, but I did see his appearance on, I believe it was Fox News Business, which, as far as I know, is probably the most mainstream attention that the term deep state has ever received.
Wow.
And what was also very strange to me, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around all this because, one of the people I criticize very strongly in A Very Heavy Agenda as being sort of a propaganda conduit for parts of the deep state was Eli Lake, a journalist for Bloomberg, someone who has appeared on numerous neoconservative think tank talks, Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Foreign Policy Initiative. And he actually wrote an article that is almost identical to what Kucinich was saying. He actually calls his article The Political Assassination of Michael Flynn. And I was actually pretty alarmed reading someone like Eli Lake, who I consider a total propagandist, using terms like, this is what a police state looks like, referring to this idea of the intelligence agencies trying to undermine the presidency. He was using language that someone like him doesn't normally use. He even referred to our country as a banana republic. If we start doing things like this, if the intelligence agencies are politically assassinating officials that are holding office, then that's something more akin to a banana republic than a democracy. And I thought it seemed to, it's almost like a flip of the paradigm in my mind to hear someone like Eli Lake talking this way. And throughout this process, I have been trying to understand. I guess what I've been trying to do is really look at Flynn. What he was trying to do. Is this really all about his alleged Russia connections, or is it about something else? And I'm kind of in between.
Okay.
What he was actually kicked out of the administration for. But I think there's no denying the fact that someone in the intelligence agencies leaked information that led to his resignation. And we still don't know who did that. Obviously, they're anonymous, but one could assume that they were from the very highest levels of some of these intelligence agencies, and that's what's making people think that this so-called deep state is basically coming for Trump and is going to try to undermine him in any way they possibly can.
So, but it's very strange, that Kucinich and this guy Lake, who is he? Would you call Lake a neocon?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so you got Kucinich, who's anything but a neocon under normal circumstances, and then you have Lake, and they're using the same language to describe what just happened. And Flynn, who you mentioned, just for people that, it's hard to keep up with the dizzying amount of stuff coming out of the White House now, but Flynn was going to be head of the National Security Council, and of course he got taken out. And what they actually had over him is not necessarily 100% clear, but what is clear is he's gone, and we've got this new guy in. And I'd love your opinion if you have one on the new guy. I'm drawing a blank on his name right now.
You know what? I probably don't know enough about him to speak intelligently about the new guy.
Okay.
But I can tell you that Flynn is a very unique and interesting player in Trump's administration, or previous player since he's out now. Because on one hand, you have all these people who understandably want détente with Russia, including myself, who saw Trump's probably one of the only good campaign promises he made, besides what you mentioned in the intro, that he was sort of anti-neocon, so that he also wanted to make friends with Russia and lower tensions and de-escalate things with Russia. Mm-hmm. So I think there were people who thought that Flynn was going to be sort of a primary emissary of some kind for that happening. Now, the only reason I can't completely buy that idea is because Flynn himself has very disturbing neocon connections. And one of the most obvious ones is that he co-wrote a book with Project for the New American Century, one of the founders, Michael Ledeen.
Wow, so he's on their payroll.
Well, he's definitely, let's just say that he sits in this weird world where I believe a lot of the neocons who didn't get on the Stop Trump bandwagon, who never got on this Never Trump campaign, actually, some of them actually admired Trump. They admired his swagger, his ability to, his big stick approach, if you will.
Right.
His quote unquote Jacksonian spirit. These are things that I think certain neocons, and I would almost describe them, and I wrote an article for Mint Press News about this where I referred to, the neocons were described by Ray McGovern and people that he worked with as the Crazies during the Reagan administration. But some of these people I would almost describe as the craziers, because they go above and beyond some of the traditional neoconservative values. And actually, I believe there was a split sometime around the end of the Bush administration where a lot of the more hardcore Islamophobes that were neocons that were friends with Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, mm-hmm. they sort of split off and wanted to employ their own strategy of ramping up Islamophobia instead of dialing it down in lieu of a more geopolitical outlook. So a lot of the neocons went to this idea of Russia and China were our next priorities. And then on the other hand, you had a lot of neocon holdovers who were still very focused on Iran, very focused on Islamic terrorism, and that being the primary focus of sort of their neocon agenda. And actually, some of these neocons, Michael Ledeen, for example, he was very pro-Trump, and some of his ideas actually got into the very first 2 weeks of the Trump administration. Flynn saying he was putting Iran on notice, for example, seems straight out of a playbook of neoconservatism to me. And then when you consider that John Bolton, James Woolsey, who else? I'm forgetting some other names. But John Bolton and James Woolsey specifically were Project for the New American Century neocons who were always obsessed with attacking Iran. And they were advising Trump leading into the campaign. Bolton almost got Secretary of State. Trump might still be giving him a job. We don't know yet how that's going to pan out. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I think the idea of counting on Flynn to be some sort of means to a détente with Russia is on very faulty ground to begin with. That idea that he was going to lower the tensions, and that, let's just say that Trump was really serious about wanting détente with Russia, I think that it is short-sighted to think that Flynn was going to be the means to do that, just based on his record. I haven't seen Flynn, trying to escalate tensions with Russia. He's not part of that sort of neocon consensus, but he is part of a different neocon consensus that's still very fixated on war with Iran, which, it's almost like, do you want war with Russia or war with Iran? It's kind of what we could have been looking at with a Hillary or a Trump presidency. But then you have Trump telegraphing very strongly right now, where he knows, at least in part, that trying to make friends with Russia is very politically risky, and that he's already sort of pulling back on that. I mean, you just had his UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, say that we must sanction Assad over chemical weapons. She's also saying that we're not going to lift any of the sanctions on Russia until they give back Crimea. Sounds an awful lot like the type of stuff Victoria Nuland and other people from Hillary's, Obama State Department were saying before. So we already almost kind of see a reversal. So I want to stress that I think that there is definitely an insider consensus for wanting to wage war with Russia that I don't think dominates Trump's platform. I don't think very many of these people are in his cabinet, but I do think that it doesn't necessarily mean that Trump is the good guy in this scenario either. A lot of his people have incredibly hawkish, dangerous, irresponsible, to say the least, foreign policy views. So we're dealing with, and so it's kind of like, but at the same time, the deep state, this concept of the deep state trying to undermine Trump's presidency, if that's really happening, it's really dangerous. So there's no, I guess I'm having a hard time seeing any silver lining to what's going on right now, either way. So I guess that's kind of what's making me hesitant to completely accept what someone like Dennis Kucinich is saying. And at the same time, you have Trump actually making very close allies with people that I've been studying for years as being classic deep state players, deep state emissaries, if you will, like Rudy Giuliani, who I think is kind of fits the textbook definition of a deep state insider. And so I just think that the framing of it needs a little bit more nuance here, where I believe there are actually different factions of this so-called deep state apparatus operating at once inside these agencies. And as the public, we have no way of knowing, which ones, all we can tell is that there is an agenda to go to war with Russia and to escalate tension with Russia, and that there is a determination from the inside to do that, regardless of what Trump's, rhetoric says. So that is very scary.
What do you think about the literally relentless media barrage about Russia? Russia stole the election, Trump's in cahoots with Russia, Putin put Trump in the White House. I mean, it's obviously nonsense, but the amount of time and energy and airtime that's been devoted to selling that story. I mean, some of it obviously is DNC driven,
Yes.
but but I think there may be more to it. That I'm wondering if pressure isn't being put on Trump not to behave sanely with Russia. Uh, because if it's in the news every day that he and Russia have been in cahoots for years or whatever, and that Putin helped undermine the election, it just makes any positive thing he does try to attempt to do with Russia look bad. And it reminds me of when Reagan, another nut job in the White House, he came to the conclusion that endless hostility with Russia, then the Soviet Union, didn't really make much sense either. And I think he was trying to take steps to modify that position. And then all these things kept cropping up that sort of forced him back into an aggressive stance. And then if we go back further, I think it was Eisenhower even who was attempting something similar. And the next thing you know, one of the U-2 spy planes is shot down under very bizarre circumstances over Russia. It was almost like they pushed the pilot to do risky things so that he would get shot down.
Yep.
It seems like, if we look at the history of the United States and Russia, ever since the Russian Revolution, there's been just open antagonism against that country. And anybody that's tried to say, all right, look, yeah, maybe they're not the world's, maybe the government over there isn't the world's greatest thing, but let's not waste all our time, money, and energy on battling them. So I don't even know if I've even asked you a question, but taking it to Trump, what do you make of the intense media barrage that's put Russia in the highlight, every day, 24/7?
It's incredibly disturbing. I mean, and this is, you've watched a very heavy agenda. If you recall back to part two of a very heavy agenda was the main purpose of it was to show this sort of the seeds being planted years ago, back in 2013, 2014, to try to paint Russia as being this enemy of ours. And it slowly escalated over the next 3 years, to the point where we are now in a climate that I would argue is actually worse than literal McCarthyism from the 1960s. I
50s.
think 50s. Yeah, I think it has actually surpassed it, where there was more reason, I think, back then. Let's just say, even though it was hysterical, it was paranoid, there was a little bit more of a legitimate, I would say, backing for that era of McCarthyism than there is now, because Russia was communist. We were, it was like it made more sense on a surface level. But I'm not making any excuses for it. What I'm saying is that right now, this is just so hyperbolic and so detached from reality that it is clearly manufactured. And we have been indoctrinated for years to believe that Russia is not only our enemy, but that Trump is somehow basically a Manchurian candidate. I mean, that's kind of where the logic is, they want that logic to lead there. So you think that not only did, Russia help elect Trump by hacking the DNC, which I think is complete BS. They haven't shown us any proof of that whatsoever. But now Trump himself might actually be some kind of secret Russian plant, who's going to cash in on Russian business dealings, and that Russia, it's not just that Russia helped get him elected, it's that Trump is actually a Manchurian candidate. And when you see generic Democrats or even just celebrities, comedians, repeating this rhetoric, I think we're living in a very precarious, scary time for just for our own sanity as a country, and I'm just very concerned that it hasn't dialed back at all. I was under this false impression that once Trump got in, that moving train that seemed unstoppable would at least slow down and wouldn't really have anywhere to go. But that actually doesn't seem to be the case at all. It seems like what you said, one of the first parts of your your question, you said that it almost seems like they're trying to force Trump's hand so that to make it really difficult for him to lower tensions with Russia, to have a détente with Russia, because they're trapping him from all sides in all these different ways. So I think that is, you know, can I swear on this, or is this?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that there does definitely seem to be a psychological operation to mindfuck Donald Trump to the point where he doesn't know how to have a détente with Russia, that it almost seems politically impossible for him. And I think that they're already succeeding in that way. Because I think, I mean, I think Trump is a liar on many issues. I mean, he's almost pathological, but I do believe that he actually wanted to do this because it isn't politically popular. I mean, it's not something that would have gained him necessarily more votes, I don't think. It's so I think that they almost have to force him in a situation where he can't see any path forward in doing that. And I think that they've almost, they pretty much largely succeeded in that. I mean, one example in that is Obama sent almost 10,000 troops to Poland right before he got out of office as a show of force, along with NATO, an exercise against Russia's border, right up against Russia's border. Trump could have immediately sent those troops home when he got in, but he didn't. They're still there. And I think that we are literally witnessing in real time a juggling act that he's trying to do to stem the flow of whatever these forces are that are trying to force his hand with Russia. And it's coming from not just it's not just coming from insiders in the intelligence agency, like you said. It seemed to be mostly coming from the DNC and DNC loyalists and Hillary's people at first. I mean, even the White House itself was dragging its feet on this accusation that the DNC was hacked by Russia. Obama didn't even really endorse that idea until the very end of his presidency. And I think that that's really scary when you see, a political party's organization hiring, tech firms to investigate the hacks and then releasing press releases saying they found out Russia did it. I mean, it's feasible that they wanted to create this narrative from the very beginning, and they just hired a tech firm that was willing to say whatever they wanted, which was that Russia was involved. I mean, I think it's very important to look back on how this all first started. And actually, I'm inclined to believe the DNC, in their very first mention of being hacked by Russia, when they actually said that we think Russians hacked us and stole our Trump opposition research. And part of me is actually willing to believe that is the real story here, that it's possible, and I'm not saying there's any proof for this yet, but it's possible that Russia did hack to try to get Trump opposition research because they didn't know anything. They didn't know what Trump was all about. They didn't. Why would Russia trust this guy? I mean,
sure.
This whole notion that Putin loves Trump and that he's tried to get him elected, to me, it's cartoonish. It's a fantasy because Putin is obviously not an idiot. He remembers the Cold War. He knows the U.S. game theory. Russia has its own game theory strategy. Why on earth would he trust and take seriously Trump at face value in this? He knows the way the U.S. operates. He knows how easy it is for these things to get reversed and go the other direction very quickly. So I think that it actually does make sense if you isolate that one single iteration, which was the very first story that the DNC said they got hacked in, which that's all they said that was stolen from them. I'm actually inclined to believe that, but only that version of the story, because all these other versions are claiming that Russia gave WikiLeaks all of John Podesta's emails. They gave WikiLeaks the DNC emails. It's very likely it came from an insider in the DNC. There's no, I mean, to me, that seems like the most likely scenario. And unfortunately, so many people have bought into this idea that Russia hacked the DNC and gave an advantage to Trump that I don't think there's any really going back from it now. I mean, look at North Korea allegedly hacking Sony, for example. That was, the media acted like that was a proven slam dunk case for, when that whole story broke, that North Korea hacked Sony because they were angry at the interview. That because it's that movie shows the assassination
Right.
of I forgot his name, but
Yeah. Forgettable guy.
yeah. But so what happened was it was actually years later when the same sources, the same experts said actually it's now looking like North Korea didn't hack Sony. It was an insider in Sony. But that came out 2 years later. The
Right.
damage was already done. I mean, so we might have something like that, and a sort of like save face moment where they admit that they had never had any proof and that it was all innuendo, speculation. And the best thing they've been able to throw at us are these insider, these documents that are just simply assessments. These are not, and even intelligence insiders like William Binney and Ray McGovern will explain quite clearly that these intelligence assessments are not worth anything. They are intelligence insiders openly speculating in a document that's passed around to other intelligence officials. These aren't breakdowns. These aren't investigations and sort of, here's Exhibit A, here's Exhibit B. They're not even written that way. If you look at some of these documents yourself, like the ODNI report, which actually mentions my sister's show in it as an example on evidence that Russia manipulated the election.
Right.
Which blows my mind that they would spend half of this document talking about RT, and then only a small section of it explaining the hacking. But again, just repeating most of the talking points from the mainstream media. They don't even have anything new in this document. And then of course you have the crazy attempt to throw out this document claiming that Trump was blackmailed by Russia and that there's videotape of him hiring prostitutes to urinate on a bed. Like that came out right before, right after he won the election.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, I was thinking, this does seem like an attempt to get inside Trump's head. It doesn't even seem like, that's the first thing that I thought, and I still think that that document was meant not to make Trump think that the Russians were blackmailing him, but I think it had a dual purpose to make Trump believe that the intelligence agencies inside the U.S. and U.S. government insiders were going to be blackmailing him, and that they possibly had things that they could hold above his head to manipulate him. And so, I can't prove that, but I can. The MI5 agent, ex-MI5 agent who released that, has some very bizarre connections. He was Litvinenko's partner. Litvinenko died under mysterious circumstances where everybody claims that Putin poisoned him with polonium.
Right.
In my mind, all of the research I've done on Litvinenko, I think it's equally likely that he was actually murdered by someone in the MI5 or the U.S. government, simply to make Putin look like a murderer. That might sound crazy to people, but at the same time, I think we've murdered people in this country. And I don't just mean by waging war in Iraq and things like that. I think that U.S. government has actually ordered assassinations on American citizens in this country. And what better way to obfuscate that or to rewrite history to make it seem like Russia is the only country that's doing this, and not the most powerful empire in the world, the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. For this, there's so many cases. One that not talked about much was the murder of a guy named Fred Hampton decades ago in Chicago. And, that was an assassination. The guy was home in bed. He had no criminal, charges against him or anything. And the local police, who were found later to have been working directly with the FBI, went in and just, butchered him, basically. And he was a young man. He was very popular. He was very positive. He had a great effect of bringing together people from all different walks of life, different racial backgrounds. In fact, he might have been the guy that coined the whole term rainbow, coalition, which got taken on. But anyway, there's a case of somebody who clearly was murdered for political reasons by elements of the U.S. government. So yeah, I mean, this clearly happens. And there's questions about how exactly Martin Luther King died and the bizarreness around the supposed assassin of him, who the family doesn't believe he was alone in doing it. And it goes on and on. We cover a lot of that on Brass Check. You scratch any of these lone nut assassin stories, and they just don't make sense.
Yeah,
that's a whole other issue. But I think the media has succeeded. Now when we say the media, are we talking about what people think of as the media, or are we talking about an intelligence agency controlled and/or infiltrated system? But anyway, let's call them the media for now. I think they have largely succeeded in insinuating and getting the average person to accept the idea that Trump may have some special relationship with Russia. And the point that you made earlier too is that this is disturbing because, like him, love him, or loathe him, he is the president of the United States, and absent fact. Now, if he commits a crime and the facts are there and they're 100% clear, well, then hang him, or do whatever. But there's no fact behind any of this. I mean, when have you ever seen a president of the United States, maybe Obama got some of that, being so thoroughly discredited is not even the word. It's beyond discredited. It's unprecedented.
No, it's completely unprecedented. And I wanted to go back to one of the things you mentioned about this idea that the U.S. government has conspired to murder people like Martin Luther King on some level, or even John F. Kennedy, because there's a really interesting component happening here that I haven't really had a chance to talk about, and I just like to talk about it briefly now, which is that Roger Stone is he's a Trump proxy. He wasn't officially part of Trump's campaign leading into the election, but what he did do, which I thought was very fascinating, is he dropped a lot of hints in conspiracy culture, and he rose his presence rose very quickly in conspiracy theory culture around the time that he wrote a book accusing accusing Lyndon B. Johnson of being behind the JFK assassination. Mm-hmm. So here you have a very close friend to Donald Trump, someone who I believe was strongly involved in the campaign, even though officially claimed he wasn't, putting out this narrative that the quote unquote deep state, and at the top levels of the U.S. government, the vice president conspired in murdering JFK. So here we have someone who's an expert, seemingly an expert in the deep state, creating this notion that Trump is that the deep state is essentially coming for Trump, that they were already coming from him months before the election. Now, that's part what makes me slightly hesitant to, let's say, jump on board of that on that idea, because I believe it was almost strategic, where Trump wanted, on some level, for people to think of him that way, even before this all started. So that, I think, creates an interesting dynamic where you have his own people feeding into this narrative that the deep state is against him, that they're coming for him. And I think it actually, in some ways, gives him an advantage, because if they do try to undermine him more, he will be seen as this underdog, almost like a JFK-like figure who's being conspired against by the deep state. But at the same time, there do seem to be truthful elements to that narrative. So it gets a little complicated, and I wanted to go back to Rudy Giuliani and his connections to the deep state, because there's, we talk about Litvinenko, we talk about all these people that Putin supposedly assassinated. The actual orders to assassinate people came directly from Putin himself. But I wanted to go back to an interesting case that I think needs to be explored more, that happened. The first victim of the 2001 anthrax attacks was a reporter for the Florida Sun named Robert Stevens, who made the Bush family very, very upset by running a picture and a full-page photo and an article about George Bush's daughters being alcoholics and being huge party animals. And the picture that was shown and ran in this magazine was of Bush's daughters falling on the ground drunk. One of them's humping the other one's leg, and they're both, it looks like in the picture, they're both smoking joints. So this, I mean, I think there's a 60 Minutes interview maybe with Laura Bush talking about how upset it made her that the daughters weren't off limits to the press. And she's specifically talking about Stevens' article. Now, the interesting part is, and the tragic part is, that Robert Stevens was the first person to die in over 30 years from an anthrax infection. Now, of all the people in the world, in the United States to get infected with anthrax, it was this man who wrote a story that deeply offended the Bush family. Now, now it gets even stranger when you can look at all of Rudy Giuliani's bizarre connections to 9/11, his foreknowledge. That's a whole other rabbit hole. But there was an interesting incident where Rudy Giuliani, after the anthrax attacked his building, which was later discovered to be U.S. manufactured anthrax, it came from inside a U.S. bioweapons lab. Rudy Giuliani's company, Bio One, actually tried to buy the building of the Florida Sun after they decontaminated the building. So Rudy Giuliani's company was hired and paid possibly millions of dollars. We can only go based on other auditing records for what the government paid to decontaminate the post office in Brentwood, for example, which cost over $3 million.
Wow.
Rudy Giuliani's company was hired to decontaminate the Florida Sun. In the process of doing that, he tried to buy the building, and while he was renting, I think he only managed to rent the building for a certain period of time, he destroyed all of the archives of all the journalists who worked in the building.
What?
So they sued. So the only real record of this is these journalists tried to sue Rudy Giuliani's company for destroying their valuable photographs from decades of doing journalism there. But it is very interesting and peculiar that one of Trump's closest associates appears to have not only profited for the 2001 anthrax attacks, but destroyed evidence of a major crime scene, and really was never followed up on. And we're also talking about the man who destroyed the World Trade Center evidence too, who shipped off the steel, and actually through various mob connections that he had, made it untraceable where a lot of that steel went.
My head is spinning. So that's unbelievable. So just to recap, because I want to make sure everybody got that. Giuliani's company was hired to clean up it's called the Sun.
Yes.
The offices of the Sun were the first anthrax attack and the first anthrax death, because death by anthrax is very rare, right? So his company was hired to clean that up, and then he bought the building, or he tried to buy the building.
He tried to buy the building, yes.
Okay, so he failed to buy the building, but somehow his cleaners managed to destroy the photographic archives of the Sun?
Yes, and what's really interesting, Ken, is it was the only and this is actually not uncommon, but all of the people who died from anthrax, no letters and no source of the anthrax was ever found in any of those cases, including Stevens. We don't even know if he got a letter. That's what the FBI claims. We've never seen the letter. They never found the letter, but that's what we were told. So we honestly don't know. And what's interesting is that area that the Florida Sun building was in is a nexus for what I would describe as some of the most obvious deep state activity on record. I think 4 of the 9/11 hijackers lived there. The editor's wife of the Florida Sun rented an apartment to 2 of those 9/11 hijackers. The FBI later claimed it was a complete coincidence. They released a press release about this, actually. And also the flight schools, the flight training. Rudy Decker's, the mysterious flight instructor who appeared to have an unlimited supply of funds, even though he was almost bankrupt, was the one training these hijackers. And I recommend everybody check out Daniel Hopsicker's research about Florida and the 9/11 hijackers. It's almost, Ken, I would almost describe it as the Jim Garrison research in New Orleans and in
Mm-hmm.
Dallas, the sort of the deep state, the overwhelming evidence that there was a lot of deep state operations taking place around the time of the JFK assassination, around the time of 9/11. So I only bring this up because I wanted to just, you know, stress that even though it does appear there is an anti-Russian consensus of deep state players going against Trump, at the same time, he's very closely associated to people who are also part of other aspects of the deep state, and we can only
Sure.
speculate on what factions these people are in, what is Rudy Giuliani's real role. I mean, even in the 80s, he was defending CIA assets with his law firm. He was actually defending Manuel Noriega. That's how he lost against Ed Koch in his first mayoral run, is Ed Koch basically bludgeoned him with all these deep state connections that he had at the time. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very fascinating to me. So I just want to, and even Mike Pence himself appears to be a deep state puppet. So it is very odd that Trump would pick someone like Mike Pence, who was doing a lot of bidding for the neocons when he first got into office, as his VP. So if there is some kind of attempted coup against Donald Trump, it seems like almost Donald Trump has opened the door for it, almost like inviting a vampire in his house. I mean, that's to me what it seems like. If you want to say that Trump is the good guy in this scenario.
Well, one thing we can say is, he's got some kind of agenda. It's hard to figure out what it is, but he has some kind of agenda, and he may be undermining himself by the people that he's let into the White House. And yeah, because Mike Pence, I mean, where did that guy come from? I mean, now it's normalized, but I mean, he's totally out of the blue. I mean, he's from Indiana and all that. But still, I mean, he had no connection to Trump whatsoever. And then suddenly Trump needs a VP, and suddenly this guy becomes it. And I always tell every people, you better know who Mike Pence is, because he is either going to operate as the president or he's going to be the president at some point. That's just a gut feel. I have to say.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think you're not off the mark there. I mean, Mike Pence is someone who, I mean, if you look at the details of why Flynn had to go, it's because apparently he tried to circumvent Mike Pence. So you might be onto something there, where maybe there's already a distrust among Trump's own people of Mike Pence. And this is also an interesting thing I want to throw out there, that Frank Gaffney, one of the PNAC signatories, a huge neocon, who also went in a pro-Trump direction, in his regular radio show, Secure Freedom Radio, he would have on as regular guests, which didn't include a large pool of people. And among these guests, one of his regulars was Mike Pence, another one was James Woolsey, another was John Bolton, and another was Newt Gingrich. And
No kidding.
And these are all people who are extremely pro-Trump, and I would describe them as, hardcore neoconservatives, with the exception of Newt Gingrich. He's kind of not, most people don't think of him that way. But I think a lot of this, this Trump cabinet and this little clique of people has been in the works for a while. But yeah, Mike Pence's role is very mysterious. But I do know that Mike Pence was actually heavily involved in pushing anthrax Saddam propaganda when he first became I don't know if he's a senator or congressman. But,
wow.
But Mike, I wrote an article called it's on Mint Press News, called "Trump Promised to Drain the Swamp, but He's Filling It with Bush Era Crazies Instead." And in the bottom section of the article, I go into Mike Pence's bizarre history with the anthrax attacks, and he actually claims he himself was attacked with the anthrax in an office that was actually in a totally different building than where the anthrax was originally discovered. So there's some strange connections here with some of Trump's people.
Wow, mind-boggling. And this is the kind of depth that we cannot get from virtually any other source. I mean, the idea that Mike Pence made a claim that he was an anthrax victim, which sounds a little dubious to me, that's really disturbing. Hey, this is a little bit off the topic, but I'd be interested in your gut reaction to it. I know you sure probably haven't had time to dig into it, but and I don't know where this all fits into the picture, but the number of deaths that are taking place among the Russian diplomatic corps. Um, we've got the ambassador to Turkey who was shot dead in a very photogenic setting. I mean, that was just bizarre to me. You know, he's in this pristine white gallery, and the cameraman didn't even flinch. Uh, you know, he kept the camera. I mean, who stands there in a room while somebody's shooting another human being and holds the camera steady? Just suspicious to me. That same day, another Russian diplomat was shot to death in his apartment in Moscow under bizarre circumstances. They found the gun, and the gun was under the bathroom sink. Of course, the United Nations Russian ambassador, died last week. The Russian ambassador to India died about a week ago of a brief illness. The Russian consul in Athens was found dead in his apartment in early January. No evidence of a break-in. And then on it goes. I don't know. Is there anything to comment on there? I mean, you probably haven't had a chance to look at this, but I mean, that's a lot of deaths in one organization in a short time.
Well, I could really only speculate, but I mean, it's extremely bizarre. And of course, you know, these Russia hysterics, a lot of these mainstream media figures are making all of those deaths seem like they're all somehow, you know, a series of hits by Putin.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, like I was saying earlier, I do not know, you know, to what lengths the U.S. is willing to go to make it appear that Putin is murdering people. And also, I mean, that first assassination you brought up is very, very strange because it was actually done by a Turkish intelligence guy, wasn't it? Or didn't he have connections to Turkish intelligence?
He probably did. I mean, I think he was originally described as a policeman, but, you know.
Yeah, he was one of the security guards, supposedly to protect this guy.
Right, but we all know that. I mean, there's a Robert F. Kennedy scenario where it looks pretty clear that Sirhan did not shoot him, but a policeman with intelligence connections was standing behind him, and Kennedy ended up with powder burns right on the back of his head. You know, so the fact that he was described as a security guard or a policeman doesn't indicate how deep his connections might go.
Yeah, so I think, and then Turkey's a very interesting component of this because the term deep state itself was actually used openly and sort of celebrating the term by Erdogan himself. He said that Turkey does have a deep state, and that it's really what's calling the shots. I'm obviously not quoting him. I'm paraphrasing, but so when you look at that, I mean, I think it's quite obvious that, you know, the U.S. On some level has a relationship with Turkey's deep state apparatus, and that it was, you know, possibly even a hit ordered by people within U.S. intelligence. I mean, I think that that's very likely. However, this is all, you know, spy versus spy, complicated. It's paranoia inducing. It's very difficult to tell what's going on, and I think on some level it is meant to use this term again. It's meant to mindfuck the Russian government. If, let's just say, they're not behind any of this, you know, and why would they assassinate their own diplomat like that on live TV? It seems pretty unlikely.
They can just call him back if they don't like him.
Yeah,
they could call him back, put him on trial for some trumped up charge, and deal with him that way. I mean, why? Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
And it also doesn't make sense why a Turkish guy who has roots in Syria or whatever they were trying to say would assassinate a Russian diplomat and act like it was some kind of heroic act against Russia for destroying Syria. I mean, that just really, I think that's really hard for me to swallow, especially when you consider that, you know, the CIA was really meddling in Syria before Russia even got there with their official, you know, bombing campaigns and all that stuff. So it is strange how, I mean, and that's the thing. It's Ukraine, it's Syria, and it's this idea that Trump is a Manchurian candidate, and all those things are still being propelled and thrown in our face as, Russia is the enemy and the U.S. are the good guys, and that even now Trump is the bad guy because he's being controlled by Russia somehow. So it is odd how this train just keeps moving, regardless of the fact that we have a president in there who said he wants to make friends with Russia.
Well, I have to think that the money involved in keeping this, I call it the endless war against Russia, it's not a shooting war between the two countries now, but it's an economic war. It's a there's countries where we get involved in to try to thwart them theoretically. Syria is an example of one. Yugoslavia was an example of one. Vietnam was an example of trying to stop the stem of communism, the flow of communism. That was ruinous to our country and to the world. Not to mention the people of Vietnam. So and a lot of money was made in it. Somewhere I saw recently that if you take the number of troops over in the Middle East and divide it by the amount of money being spent over there, the infrastructure amount required to support one U.S. troop is about $2.2 million. So for every body we put over there to stand around or do whatever they're doing, that's another $2.2 million that somebody is making. So I have to think that that's a huge motivation. And this is an old game. I mean, it's been going on since at least 100 years when the communists first took over Russia. The idea was, there's a funny poster. I don't know if you ever saw it. It was in wide circulation for when I was younger. And it says there's a Bolshevik in every bathroom. Make sure it was an ad by like Kleenex, and the idea was that if you don't put Kleenex or some kind of tissue in the bathroom, your employees are going to grumble and they're going to become Bolsheviks. Did you ever see that ad?
No.
But this is how deeply crazy things got, and it seems like that generations later there is this private-public partnership to perennially make Russia, and I'm not saying we should lay down and let Russia do whatever it wants. I mean, we have to be adult and sensible about their motives in the world, of course, but to always be fighting with them and no chance of communication, no chance of détente, no chance of partnership. It's a great tragedy because it wasted resources, wasted human potential. I mean, imagine if the U.S. and Russia got together in positive projects. I mean, we have great funds, they have amazing engineering, but that's not. I naively thought that was a possibility under Trump, but I have a feeling that there's just no way. Let me ask you another question. Your good friend William Crystal, Neocon Central, he hates Trump.
Yeah.
Like he can't. Like he just can't stop scouring the guy. What's going on there?
I think that he helped start the Never Trump hashtag, and he also was one of the first people to really start that ball rolling on getting Republicans to go away from Trump. And if I were to, it's hard for me to figure out exactly what his main reasons are for hating Trump. But I think, a lot of these neocons like Kagan, like Crystal, like these more traditional neoconservatives, they dislike Trump because they know that he will make it very easy for the United States to be seen as a dangerous country, or almost, let's say, they want America to be able to continue forward with its hegemonic vision while pretending to be the nice guy of the world. I think that that's what they want. On some level, even though they probably admire, Trump's big stick approach and his willingness, to talk tough, they don't want it to be too out in the open. They don't want that sort of unfiltered, we're gonna bomb every square inch of the Middle East to get rid of ISIS. They don't like that way of talking. Neocons have tried very hard for decades to massage their own rhetoric and to sound somehow sensible. They don't want to come off as being bloodthirsty warmongers. They want to couch it all in this intellectual rhetoric and in this intellectual framework. So the fact that Trump is reverting it back to more of a swagger, and almost like General Patton style, he's bringing it back to a form of American foreign policy rhetoric that is stuff that in the history books seems embarrassing to look back on now, like wanting to bomb Vietnam back to the Stone Age and things like that. And look at what the way Ted Cruz was talking going to the election. I think that Trump and Ted Cruz were sort of using rhetoric from the same playbook. They were, rolling back that sort of neoconservative, friendly warmongering to just straight up, warmongering and tough talk. And I think that certain neocons like Crystal are very worried about that sort of taking over our sort of the face of foreign policy.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because going back to Jimmy Dore, he has repeatedly said, even before the election, that the good thing about Trump is that he puts an ugly face on all these things that the United States has been doing as a matter of course. In other words, with sort of a hip guy like Barack Obama, the left certainly, and a lot of so-called progressives were really, and certainly the middle was certainly they were asleep. Don't hassle him. He's a good guy. He's doing his best. While he was doing horrendous things, and he could get away with it. And what Doris said, and I think is proving to be absolutely right, is that Trump he puts the ugly on the ugly, and it's the positive thing is he's getting people out into the streets to protest against him. He's getting record donations to the ACLU. He's getting he's turning activist attorneys into national heroes. So he's having a strangely positive, unintended on his part, effect. Wow, this is so you're as baffled as the average person is then about this. I mean, you have a deeper background, and I want to remind everybody that Robbie is the maker of the film A Heavy Agenda, which is an epic, really. It's 3 films. It's, I think, 7 hours long. You don't have to watch the whole thing. You can, watch part 1 or just part 3, but watch some of it. And what Robbie did with that film is he took hours and hours and hours and hours of media that, kind of slips by us every day. We're busy with our lives. We can't follow everything these people say. And he shows the patterning, the deliberate, relentless patterning that goes on from various factions, and you can really see, wow, they're creating war where there is no need for war. They're creating antagonism and rancor and paranoia where there's no justification for it. So even with your expertise in detecting these patterns, even you're having trouble figuring out what these guys are up to.
For sure, because things. And I think part of that is because things have changed and accelerated to a rate I never saw when I was working on A Very Heavy Agenda. I mean, the sort of the anti-Russia hysteria, went completely off the rails and went nuclear after I finished the films, which is kind of, it's good and bad. I mean, I don't even know, looking back on what happened since I finished part 3. How I would have been able to even cover that, because it's, and that's sort of what I'm working on now, Ken, is how do I, move forward with the series and capture what's going on, because we are in a state of flux and confusion, and I believe it's in part deliberate, this confusion, and I wanted to, maybe you've been following this too, is this whole idea of quote-unquote fake news.
Yes. I've
been looking at it very closely. The very first iterations of it came from suspicious sources, and I believe it's a weaponized term designed to make people more confused. And it's a double-edged sword. It's not just, it only makes one side confused. It makes everybody more confused, and it's harder to know what to believe. And, that's been happening for the past 2 years, for sure. There's been a lot of intentional confusion out there, but I think that this takes it to a whole new level where now, you even have Trump using it to deflect any criticism of his. And then you have people in the MSN saying that fake news is what got Trump elected, that Russia is behind fake news. Or you even have these people saying that alternative media outlets are all fake news, including some rather good alternative media outlets that I read regularly. So I think that's a new thing, and it's injected a lot of confusion, and I believe deliberately into what's going on right now. And I just don't know how we can come back from this. And I guess what worries me, Ken, is that this fake news concept and the rise of things like Pizzagate sort of exploding so fast on the internet that they might actually use this concept of fake news to finally censor parts of the internet. And we already kind of see it happening. And whether you believe there's something to Pizzagate or not, I personally don't. I think a lot of it is innuendo. There's a lot of smoke and no fire. But I have already started to see venues of the internet being censored because of the popularity of that conspiracy theory. They're already shutting down YouTube channels. BuzzFeed, you'll be familiar with the fact that I called out BuzzFeed for promoting a lot of this anti-Russia propaganda.
Right.
BuzzFeed is now at the tip of the spear of throwing out this idea that maybe we should start censoring YouTube for putting out fake news. YouTube is one of the last bastions of, I wouldn't call it a social network, but it definitely has a sort of democratic spirit behind it to a certain extent. I'm sure they politically censor stuff before, but I think we've entered a new era where they will start politically censoring stuff in mass. If you cover this topic, you get your channel pulled. If you cover, this topic, you'll get your channel pulled. I mean, I'm surprised Russia Today is even still has a channel on there. I would not be surprised if 6 months from now, YouTube pulled down Russia Today's channel. YouTube pulled down things like InfoWars. And I have a strong problems with InfoWars. I think that they have corralled people from the conspiracy movement to have this more narrow, right-wing, pro-Trump point of view. But at the same time, that would be terrible if they censored, if they stripped InfoWars YouTube channel off, because then it'll turn Alex Jones and all his followers into martyrs. And I think I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but I fear that that's the direction things are going in right now.
I did see an article, and I didn't see the source, but I guess it was BuzzFeed, that, they're basically saying, the real demon in this whole scenario is YouTube, which is, to me, laughable. Yep. Just laughable. YouTube, I'm sure somebody has made this comparison before, but back before the original American Revolution, there was this phenomenon of pamphleteers, and that was a function of technology, because suddenly there were printing presses, and there were a lot of them in North America, and there was money to be made printing stuff, and a lot of people would print their political opinions and distribute them, and it was quite a vibrant scene of a variety of opinions, and opinions from obviously all spectrums. And to me, that's what the internet, and I think YouTube is taking on the role of for lack of a better word, soapbox in a public square more than any other source. I mean, Twitter, you can't really do much with 140 characters. Facebook is pretty much all cats and silliness. People don't really go to Facebook to get deep into stuff, right? It's hard to unwind a really complex argument on Facebook. But YouTube, the sky's the limit. And then you have people like, let's say, Jimmy Dore. I know you're a fan too. He's kind of come out of nowhere, and I've seen his subscriber rate double in just a matter of months, from 100 to 200,000, which is fantastic. And he's exactly the kind of person that we need to be hearing from, because he's got no axe to grind. He's got a definite political slant, which he lets you know what it is. He's not hiding, and he shows you his vision of the world through his slant. Totally legitimate. Totally legitimate. I don't even mind if the right wing crazy neocons have their channel, but just be legit about it. Which they're they're clearly not. But I think it's very important that a heavy agenda was made, because, and I'm glad to hear you're trying to figure out how to continue the series, because it shows that this media, I don't even know how to describe it. maybe that's the intention of all this stuff, but that these calculated, we could say this, these calculated communications campaigns to move public opinion in ways that are not in the best interests of Americans has been going on for a long time. There's something that preceded what's going on now. Now, maybe it's accelerated now. It certainly has. Maybe it's more lunatic than it was, but the seed of it is clear in your film. You know what I mean? It's an evolution. It's an evolutionary process. Okay, now we're in a speeded up mode.
Yeah.
But I think having documented what it was like before this was a very valuable and important thing to do. And again, guys, I can't encourage you enough. If you want to see, manipulation and communications programs that are kind of operating. See, I guess the film, what your film documented, is these things operating out of consciousness. In other words, they were moving the ball down the field with their agenda, but it was being done almost in a way that you couldn't even see it happening before it hit you. If I'm making myself clear.
No, totally, exactly, yeah.
Whereas now it's like, all the baseball bats are out and they're just sort of, but the weird thing is, as you pointed out, they're doing it in such a way that you can't even get your footing. You don't even know who's representing who and who's on whose side and who's, what's. However, I think if we step back, the one thing we know for sure is there's a lot of money to be made, has been made, is being made, will be made by continuing antagonism with Russia.
Yes.
If we take this back to the original thought, and nowhere in the news media, with the exception of Dennis Kucinich sticking his head up and saying a few things, is anybody talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, there's some pushback against the idea that the DNC was hacked by the Russians, and unfortunately it only comes from mainstream media outlets like, say, some people on Fox News. But the problem is, a lot of the people who are skeptical of that, like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson, were some of the biggest Iraq war propagandists there were on the media. Right. So it presents this problem where it's like, well, are we supposed to trust these people's intuition now? Because, even though I agree with them on those issues, I'm pained to, promote their work in any way because they have such a horrible track record. So and so you can really only trust someone like Dennis Kucinich, who has been consistent on these issues for so many years, or even Ron Paul, who was basically echoing similar sentiments. So yeah, it's so unfortunate that, in what I covered in Very Heavy Agenda, that framework and that they're kicking that ball down the field, like you're saying, kind of in the background in a way that it was hard for people to tell. And now that they don't even need to do it that way anymore because people have been so indoctrinated for years to feel this way. So it's almost like, oh, of course Trump's a Putin plant. Or even this idea of being a Putin apologist or being a Putin useful idiot for taking positions that are in opposition to the U.S. government right now is so absurd that it's hard to believe we're there, but we are. And that's the part that worries me most, is how do you roll that back? And I don't think Trump, even if he tries détente with Russia from this point forward, I just don't know how you can roll that back, that indoctrination. And that's what worries me the most. It's not even just that the mainstream media is pushing out propaganda and the intelligence agencies are. It's that people themselves, the public, is already so brainwashed into being primed for believing this stuff that puts us in a very dangerous predicament that I just do not know how we go back from it. I think I said this on the last time, chat we had, which I think we're in a worse position now in terms of letting our guard down in the American public that we were after 9/11. I actually believe
Wow.
that I think we were in a more, let's say there were more critical minds speaking out after 9/11 than there are now that are getting airtime. And I think that's very dangerous. There's way more consensus now. And the people that were supposed to, that were some of these critics under Bush after 9/11 were more left-leaning Democrats. All of them now are completely, McCarthyite, propaganda peddlers. So
Yep.
that's really bad. And so what do we have now? The right wing are the skeptics now against this, Putin hacking the DNC or Trump being a Manchurian candidate. I mean, it's probably more partisan for them. But then you also have the problem with the conspiracy movement itself letting their guard down and always presenting Trump as the underdog, as the hero up against, all these other forces. And I think that also presents a problem because I think, conspiracy-minded people ought not to think of it in such a binary way. The mainstream media are lying to us, and so is Trump. I mean,
Right.
That's the inherent problem here. It's not an either-or scenario, and somehow, with the help of people like Alex Jones, Roger Stone, a lot of these more right-wing alternative media outlets, they presented Trump as this hero underdog against the deep state, against these neocons, and I think that is also dangerous because that's not necessarily the truth. We don't. Based on almost everybody who's known Trump for a long period of time, figures like Howard Stern, his co-writer of the book Art of the Deal, the thing that comes through the most clearly with the people who have known Trump the longest, who aren't friends with him anymore, is that he doesn't have any core ideology at all.
He's a businessman. He's a real estate developer.
Yeah.
He's a brander. He's a TV guy. He has no depth. He doesn't read. My understanding is he doesn't read, and everything he gets from TV and from talking to people, and that's as deep as it goes. And yeah. So he's somebody that could be my fear is that it's going to be very easy ultimately to corral him and push him around and get him. Force him in directions that he never intended to go into and that don't serve us.
Absolutely. I mean, look at what Obama's rhetoric was going into the election. He was going to close Gitmo. He was going to prosecute the Bush administration for torture. He's not going to, start any new wars. I mean, I remember Obama seemed like this, and I didn't vote for him at the time, but to a lot of people I knew, they picked up on this, that he was going to reverse the damage done by the Bush administration, that he was going to pull back. And look at what ended up happening. I mean, so even if Obama had the intention to do that, even if you could take what he's saying at face value, it almost went in completely the opposite direction.
Right.
The war on terror grew to enormous heights that we didn't even see under the Bush administration, waging bombing campaigns, drone campaigns in 7 countries at once. I mean, and then Hillary declaring that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was a terrorist force. We're even inching forward to war with Iran during Obama's administration until, that deal that was struck that the neocons, of course, tried to, destroy. And that now Trump going into office is saying that deal needs to be destroyed and that we're putting Iran on notice. So, like I was saying at the beginning, we're either going to get war with Russia under Hillary or we're going to get war with Iran under Trump. And I think that's the problem here, is that there's going to be more war regardless. And if we can put aside the partisanship, if we can put aside the loyalty to Trump or Hillary, or even if you like aspects of Trump and you don't like war, I think, and I've been trying to tell this to people on the alt-right who are, there's a lot of smart people on the alt-right who know a lot about neocons. And I've been trying to explain to them, even if you like Trump, you got to put his feet to the fire here to not take us into more wars, because just giving him a free pass and defending him at every turn is not going to stop these wars. It's just not. So,
right. And what people don't get about war, or they've forgotten, is every time there's a war, there is a diminution of civil liberties at home. It goes hand in hand.
Absolutely.
You
And
know.
look at what powers Trump inherited. All these people
Ugh.
like myself and my sister who are warning the next president's going to inherit all these powers if Obama doesn't roll them back. And the worst nightmare come true. If a lot of people think that Trump is a fascist, they think he's an authoritarian, and a lot of those same people gave Obama a free pass while he was president.
Yep.
And now
Yep.
you have this alleged fascist and authoritarian taking over all these powers. So this whole, the idea of a police state, which people like Alex Jones have been railing against for, better part of 2 decades, is now being inherited by Trump, who already has said he's going to crack down on. He wants to send feds into Chicago. That he's increasing the police state.
Yep.
So he's already saying he's going to increase the police state powers even without a war. So we know that what Trump's direction is going to be if there is a war, and where he's going to lean. I mean, Jeff Sessions has already said that he's going to start cracking down on states that have legalized marijuana. I mean, so I think to a lot of more libertarian Trump voters, even that was a huge shock. So I do not think we are, I think it's going to be mostly bad moving forward. And I just think if you're libertarian, if you're alt-right, if you even supported Trump and believed in his rhetoric, I still think you need to hold his feet to the fire, because this whole, people being divided into camps, being very loyal to him simply because they were so scared of Hillary, I think is a dangerous mindset, because he's the president now, and
Right.
he has inherited all these powers. And if you're anti-police state, it's not like he promised to dial it down. He never talked about the Constitution or bringing back civil liberties. That was never part of his platform. So I think we just need to be very careful moving forward.
Yeah, that may be a great place to end it, because that is the next logical course of action for alt-right and libertarian people, and people who looked at Trump as possibly someone who would shake things up and for the better. He is president. I mean, that's a good point. Like, there's no need to defend his every breath now. He's in, for better or worse. And yeah, oh my goodness. Well, I want to remind everybody that there's this great film out there called averyheavyagenda.com, and well, that's not the name of the film. It's where the website is. And I think it's good mental training, to watch that film, as much of it as you can. I've watched the whole thing. I've watched some of it twice, and it's just, I've been doing this kind of analysis for a long time, and it's just great to have somebody lay it all out, so that you can just sit there and watch it in one big chunk and see these guys are organized. And here's how they work, and here's how they operate, and here's the direction they're pushing us in. And even though it's changed in tempo, and it's changed in speed, and it's changed maybe in complexity too, it's still the same game, which is to push us the wrong, against our own interests, which seems to be the history of America sometimes. So Robbie Martin, I want to thank you for coming on, and I'm glad that you're confused too. Because it is strange. But I think you said something really interesting too, and maybe we'll end here, is that basically we have one liar, Donald Trump, and I think it's beyond debate that he's a liar, calling another group, the mainstream news media, liars, and I think it's beyond debate that they're liars. And the mainstream media is denying that they're liars, and Trump is denying that he's a liar, and they're both calling each other fake news. And we're sort of stuck in that loop. And meanwhile, all this stuff is rolling forward at warp speed behind the scenes. And we need to penetrate and get past that stage show, that Punch and Judy show, basically, and look at who's actually pulling the throttle, controlling the throttles of power, and what direction we're going in. And as you point out, it's not a good direction.
Yeah, I mean, I try to look at it this way, where I think it might have been Ken Silverstein, I'm sure other people have brought this up, that when when these power elites look at elections, a lot of the billionaires will bet on every horse in the race.
Right.
And when you're looking at the military-industrial complex, and this immovable object almost that the military-industrial complex is, it's like a glacier. It's this impenetrable force that is so powerful it literally drives countries to war. This money-making venture. So when you're looking at that, it would be naive, I think, to believe that just because most of the neocons are anti-Trump, that the military-industrial complex is still not finding a way in and betting on every horse, so to speak. There are ins, several ins, too many ins, for the military-industrial complex to, whether you think Trump is anti-war or not, to push him into a horrible direction of waging more wars. And I think we're very much set up for that. And Iran, I think, is the biggest one to worry about. But look at Trump's personality. What if Putin did something that actually genuinely angered Trump and made him feel like Russia was trying to threaten us? I mean, what would Trump's reaction be to that? So I think that, all these things need to be taken very seriously. And it's not, a black and white thing. It's not Trump versus the evil deep state empire. There is more going on here than meets the eye. And even if you do think that the deep state is trying to undermine Trump, I think that it's, in a lot of ways, like I was saying, it gives him the advantage of still appearing as if he's the underdog. And Trump's team and his people, Bannon, Roger Stone, they're smart enough to know how to run with that narrative and use it to Trump's advantage. And I think they already are, even if it's true or not. So, all these things I think need to be looked at. And hopefully, I'll have this Kickstarter page up in a few weeks here, but I'm going to do a fourth installment of a very heavy agenda.
Great.
And I'm going to try to cover, as much as I can and still track, who are these neocons that didn't go along with the Stop Trump bandwagon, and what is their agenda? And I think a lot of people will be very interested to see that there has sort of been this alt-right neocon outlier crossover, especially between the neocons who are very, very Islamophobic and who have sort of created this quasi-intellectual framework which the alt-right movement and a lot of the Trump's followers read from like a script. And it actually comes from a member of the Project for the New American Century, whether they know it or not. So I think that's a very important thing that I'm going to be covering, and also show who are these other neocons. And I just think the fake news thing is going to be covered. This idea that Trump's a Manchurian candidate. All of these, it's basically going to start right where part 3 left off. And
great.
And
great. It's just what's needed now. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, and I regret, I tried to do some prognosticating and predictive stuff in part 3 where I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. So because of that, I feel like I need to sort of go back and reanalyze some things and kind of even mention that in part 4, that I was wrong about what was going to happen.
A lot of people were wrong. I think even Trump was surprised, because if you've got the footage when he won late at night and got on in front of the microphones and started talking, to me he looked like a very sobered individual. Like, he wasn't pumping his fists and carrying on the way he normally does. He looked like he was like, I'm in this thing. Did you see that? The footage?
Oh yeah. It was very strange. Yeah, I think it was, and then later it was revealed that Hillary was so upset and actually hysterical that was the reason because she was so shocked that she couldn't even appear and do a concession speech that night.
Right.
And imagine the terrible optics of showing a crowd full of Hillary supporters bawling, and crying basically in front of her during her concession speech. I think they made a smart strategic move to not do that, because they expected the opposite result. I think that's entirely true.
Yeah, so it wasn't just you. Well, I'm really glad to hear you're working on this. And how can people follow you and keep up to date with your progress on this?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter at Fluorescent Gray. They could check the at Very Heavy Agenda Twitter account where I'll be posting all the updates for it. And also, if you search for a Very Heavy Agenda on Kickstarter, you'll find the page by the time this episode comes out. And there'll be some perks included there where if you help me fund part four, you'll get a box set for the first three parts. And I'm going to try to include different packages and tiers for people. Some and I'm sure a lot of people don't even know about a very heavy agenda in general. So even if you haven't seen the first three parts, part four will act again as a standalone film, where you don't necessarily have to see the previous three parts, but it's I definitely recommend it, but you can still watch it as a standalone movie. And I'm projecting, I'm going to say a summer release for that. It's going to be quite a few months off. So
Okay, great. Well, we'll keep tracking it, and I'll put all these links below the interview so people can follow you. I just want to say to my listeners, this is really important work. Nobody's doing anything like this, and it's a very particular kind of work that's not easy to do, takes a lot of insight to do, takes a lot of fortitude to do. There's not a lot of support for it, and yet to me, it's some of the most important work out there. Not everybody's going to see the film, not everybody's going to understand it, maybe even necessarily, but we got to start pushing back. And we want to push back from depth. We don't want to
We
just be
oftentimes
flailing
take
around.
comments from
And
them, and
Robbie's
they help
research
guide the
provides that
show.
kind of depth that we need to push back effectively. So, Robbie, thank you again so much for the time and for all your thinking and research and insights. It's very helpful. I'm so glad that I got to see parts 1 through 3 in preparation for what we're in the middle of now. It has made it a little bit easier for me to navigate.
well, thank you so much, Ken. You said a lot of very kind things, and I very much appreciate that. And thanks
Well,
for having me on.
my listeners know I don't do this often, So I'm saying it because I mean it. Um, I don't have a lot of guests on. I don't, Yeah, anyways, they know. I only do stuff like this when I think it's really important. So great. Well, thanks again, and we'll keep following you and keep working.
Thank you so much, Ken.